Hi, Kevin Ledoux at Ledoux Guitars, the Pragmatic Luther. Today, I want to show you how you can make fingerboard tapering templates. They're very useful. As you know, a fingerboard is tapered, and the width of the fingerboard at the nut, the width of the fingerboard where it meets the body or at any other point, all determine what string spacing is down here at the bridge saddle. So that has to be done very carefully. Now, if you make a lot of fingerboards the same size, a template might be really worthwhile for you to make. If you don't make a lot of them, you can, of course, take a fingerboard blank, put a center line on it, and lay that out with hand tools. And you could bandsaw that out and then hand plane the taper that you want. And that's a terrific method to do that with. And I do that from time to time if I have something that I don't have a template for. But anyway, I thought we'd look at the way you can make some fingerboard templates and then a couple of added things that you can do with those templates. The first thing I need to do is understand exactly what this taper is. And I can do that obviously by measuring the nut width or the desired nut width if you prefer. And then I can measure at any fret or any distance toward the other end of the fingerboard I want. And the greater that distance, the more accurate your results are likely to be. Now, you could use a fret position. That's one way to do it. You could use any random or convenient distance that you can work with. What I did was I took the information from the nut end to the 12th fret, I think it was, and then I extrapolated that information out to 2 feet. And what I came up with for the taper for this particular template, uh, which this fingerboard matches, what I came up with was a taper that amounts to 820 thousandths of an inch per 24 inches of length. That's very important. Using that information, we can set up a tapering jig on the table saw. This is a tapering jig for a table saw. You can buy these commercially, but I don't recommend it. They're generally too short. They're made of aluminum. They might be accurate, but the big thing is they're just too short and they're too damned expensive. If you should make one of these, you can use this to make several other tapered templates of all kinds, not just fingerboards. It's just two pieces of hardwood screwed together, just a hinge in here, and this little eye is so I can hang it up. If you put an eye in it, you got to keep that out of the way of the fence. It's about, I don't know, I'd say 1 5/8 inch, 1 3/4 tall. Doesn't have to be. This dimension is probably 1 1/8 somewhere around there. This one's a little narrower. These can vary. It doesn't matter too much. I made this tab, so to speak, screwed down here, slotted, and then underneath here there's a brass insert with a 1/4 20 thread, and this tightener will just tighten that down so that I can open it to whatever degree I want it open and stabilize it right there. The whole idea, of course, is that the tapering jig goes against the fence and consequently holds a workpiece at an angle so that when it gets ripped, it will end up wider at this end than it is at this end. And we do want it just that way. We want the narrow end to be back here, because if we were to do that the opposite way, it will tend to pull the board away from its own fence, and we don't want that to happen at all. So there's the basics of a tapering jig. Now the question is, what do we do with this to make the template that we want? Now, before I go to that next step, it just occurred to me that you may be thinking, why don't I just set this up and taper my fingerboards directly from here? Well, you can if you want to, but there is, to my mind, a terrible disadvantage to there. And in the next segment, I'm going to show you what that is before we go any further. I have a pair of fingerboard blanks here. This one is Bocote. This one is Palfero. And I selected the grain on these because it's particularly visible. Now, you might not see this on a fingerboard that has very little character, but on this, you certainly would. I traced a fingerboard on these so that you can see what happens. By lining up the edge of a fingerboard, the straight edge, and tracing its taper, you can see that the taper is there, but the grain remains straight, and it does not follow the taper at all. So it's, to my mind, you may tolerate that just fine, but to my mind, that's not just incorrect, that's just lame. It doesn't look right at all. So that's why I don't taper directly from that tapering jig on the table saw. On the other hand, you could, I suppose, um, you could lay out a fingerboard by placing it on your blank, and you could trace one edge so that you're going to kind of center it on that grain, and you could do that by eye. You could bandsaw that out and then joint it, and then you could cut your opposite edge on that table saw tapering jig. That would be one way of doing it. I'm not going to like the edge that I get here when I'm done with that too much, so I try not to use that jig for that. Plus, I want the template maybe for some other purposes. To adjust my tapering jig for the proper taper, I put a 24-inch scale on this, and I marked that 24-inch position from this, which I'll call the 0 end. Since I know that the taper I'm after is 82/100ths of an inch per 2 foot, that means that when I measure 82/100ths of an inch more here than I do here, I have the correct taper. And that is surprisingly accurate. Now, I'll admit that once you get that established, you're going to want to try a couple of 1 or 2 scrap pieces, maybe just some 1/4-inch stuff or some thin MDF or whatever you happen to have, to make sure that you've got it right, because that is critical in the end. But this should get you extremely close. And from here, you can set up the saw to rip the taper. To adjust the rip fence, I put the tapering jig against the fence and move it toward the blade and adjust it so that I get a measurement from here at the tapering jig to the left side of the tooth right here. That is, in this case, 1 3/4 inches. That's what my template calls for. I want that distance, and you want to make sure that you measure that distance not from here to a tooth up in the air, but a tooth just as it cuts the surface of the table. That's pretty important. So that's the ideal distance that I want. However, I'm going to do something additional, and you'll see why in a little while. I'm going to take my fence and I'm going to kick that over just another maybe 1/8 of an inch at the most is all I need. And then I'm going to get a piece of material like this. This just happens to be a scrap of soft maple. I would recommend that you make your templates, if you want them very, very stable, MDF is really nice. But if you use them with a shaper or a router table, they're going to wear down quickly. So it's kind of a 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. If you make them out of a stable hardwood, they're probably going to hold up a lot better, but there may be some seasonal movement that you don't want to tolerate. So you have to make that choice. One thing is for sure, if you make them up out of something like MDF, if you have a tapering jig, you can make up as many of them as you need. And sometimes it's a good idea, once you get set up to make one, make 3 or 4 so that you've got a supply of them for a number of years. I'm going to want my template material to be about 32 inches long. That's longer than you need it, or at least you would think, but you'll see why I want it longer as soon as I get this ripped out. So I want to make sure that I've got a good straight edge. If you're doing this in wood, make sure it's a good straight jointed edge. Make sure that you've got smooth surfaces, flat surfaces on the table, and so on. All of the safety needs to be observed. Now, there is a danger here because I'm going to end up with a very narrow piece in here that I've got to hold down. So this becomes dangerous. You may want to try and shove down on that with a push stick or something, because it may want to tend to jump a little bit. One way you can minimize some of that is bring the blade up a little, but be very careful. You really don't want that blade up any farther than it has to be. So let's see if we can make this work here. We're going to run this just once and hope for success. Another way you could make this taper, if you don't have a tapering jig for your table saw, or you don't care to make one, I thought I'd just throw this in. I took a scrap of plywood here and I made a mark on it parallel to a nice straight edge at a 1/2 inch in. And then you see I'm using that 1/2 inch point as my 0 point. And from there I moved 2 feet and measured over 82/100ths of an inch to represent my taper, and then squared off from there. Now what I'm going to do is take the bandsaw and I'm going to cut that line. Now it may not be perfectly straight enough to hold your workpiece. It would be pretty hard to get that perfectly straight on a bandsaw. However, if you get an inch or so here, exactly where it needs to be, and then carefully get an inch or so here where it needs to be, then you should be okay. So I'm going to do that off camera, and then we'll go back on camera and see how that works on the table saw. So now I've cut out that template and I've tested my workpiece against it, and as long as it does not rock against this edge, then we're good to go. It locks in nice and it's going to travel in a nice straight path. I've adjusted my table saw. Now, just as much care needs to be taken to do this to keep your fingers out of the way, but we'll see if we can make this work. And so there's my resultant taper, and it just occurred to me that if you made one of these very carefully, you could repeat this all you needed to. Just keep this on hand. So if you don't have a tapering jig, there's another option. Now, with your taper all ripped out, you would want to test this, measure it, and make sure that it is in fact the right taper. And as soon as you've established that, the next thing you're going to want to do is get some critical lines on it. You remember I said that I adjusted my saw a little bit narrower than the actual width that I needed, and I had a reason. We want this excess to be here. So I measured at where 1 3/4 inches is, because that's the template that I need. And I just came down here to a convenient location and measured across. I just chose 2.5 because it's easy to divide. And I struck a center point, and then I guess you can see it. There's a center line that I put on that. Now this center line is very, very important. You need to put that on there and get it right, and double and triple check it to make sure it's right. This is going to be very, very important as each edge of this. And by the way, before you do any marking on it, if you have a little bit of roughness on those edges or anything that you don't care for, if you have a jointer plane like this, or even a jack plane, I suppose would do it, take a couple of strokes down the length of that thing just to clean it up before you do any marking. It's unlikely that you would make any changes in it that would ruin its accuracy. If you don't have that, then some coarse sandpaper on a long straight beam would allow you to perfect those edges. So with my center line on there, and this critical point at 1 3/4 inches, I'm all set to go. I mean, I could use this thing right now. For demonstration purposes, I've made up just a mock-up fingerboard out of a piece of scrap poplar, and I have put a center point on it. On each end, you can see there probably that I have marked its center, and I've done that at both ends. So using those marks, the centers, I have double face taped that to my template, and I'm going to shape this here on the shaper. I also took the time to go over to the bandsaw and just take a little bit of that excess off there, because the more you're cutting with any shaper cutter or router bit, the more propensity it has to take control of the work and take it out of your hands. So if we can make it easier and safer on ourselves, we always do that. You may be able to see here sort of in the background, I'll pull the camera in a little bit. This is called a starting pin. Now, every shaper that I'm aware of has a hole drilled for one and has a starting pin. I'm not sure about router tables because I'll mention it again. I disapprove of router tables greatly. If you don't have a center pin, or a starting pin rather, they call these, if you don't have one of these in your router table, put one in. You're going to need it. It's for your safety. So we're all set to go. I have adjusted my cutter. Reviewing quickly for those that have seen it or are aware, this is a bearing that will ride against the template. It will sit there and allow the cutter head to spin, and the cutter will read exactly the template and cut that edge for us. So we'll give this a try. Now, before I do this, remember I said I wanted this extra long so that I can come into my cutter, whether it be this or a router bit, and hit that bearing and then continue to do my work. There are no handles on this because there's no room for them, unless you want to make a highly sophisticated jig that incorporates that, which maybe I should but have not. So I'm going to use my starting pin over here and move into the work, and then I can move away from the starting pin, and I'm going to keep my hands out of the way. I don't want to get in close. And you wouldn't want to do it with your router table or this or anything else. So, but just a reminder, safety always a primary concern. So let's give this a shot. And there we have our fingerboard tapered exactly to match this. Now we can do this in such a way that we control our grain orientation. Now the slope in the grain, if it's pretty straight or even if it's curved a little bit, you can eye that out so that you take best aesthetic advantage of the grain of your fingerboard. I think that's a real important consideration. But this isn't the end of what we can do with this template. I'm going to, in the next segment of this, I'm going to show you some other things that you can do to assist you even more. So here's my fingerboard, my demonstration board made of poplar. Now, I taper mine before I cut fret slots in them, but you could cut your fret slots before you taper. That would be completely up to you. No problem there. There are some advantages that you have with these templates beyond just creating fingerboards. You can, with things like clear, or in this case it's an amber acrylic, you can make a copy of this so that you have an acrylic template, which you can see through, which means you can put scribe lines on there and drill holes in them so that you can mark strategic points back on your template or on your fingerboard or whatever you may need to do there. But more importantly, to my way of thinking, and by the way, these are just handy as tracing templates and things. You know, you're going to lay out your fingerboard, you throw the template down, you trace it, quick taper it on the bandsaw, and then come back to this tapering jig. But there's something else that's really cool that you can do with these. If you make a clear acrylic, or even an amber or something like that would be okay. If you make a copy of one of these in acrylic, then by gluing these sides to them, and these sides, this is just acrylic also, and it's put on here, held on with a clamp lightly, and if you carefully drip thin cyanoacrylate in there, that's what that stuff is made for. It will glue those together very nicely, and then for registration purposes and added security, I just pinned those in with 16th inch brass pins. It doesn't have to be brass, it could be anything. And I use 16th inch because this is 1/4 inch acrylic. So by mounting a pair up here at the nut end and a pair down here around, I don't know, the 10th fret or something like that, so that they don't interfere with the body, you can then slip this over a guitar neck. This neck is too wide for this purpose, but you can slip this down over the neck, and by putting the neck on the guitar, you can dry fit your joint, and now you can look down through the body and make sure that the center line of the top coincides with the center line of the neck. Once you've made this, you just need to carefully scribe your center lines and so on it. And I even took the time, if you can see them, I took the time to scribe the string lines on these so that I could see what my string spacing is down here. I've marked it for a 24.9 and a 25.4 scale. All information that I find useful. You could use this in any way you care to. So there's the neat things you can do with fingerboard templates. I would encourage anybody to make and use these. I am the pragmatic Luther, once again, advocating that you make as much tooling as you can instead of buying it. And I advocate that not just as a matter of economics, but because by making your own tools, your tools can be made in concert with your style of work, to your specifications, and they can be made in such a way that because you'll understand what you've made, if you have any adjustments that need to be made, you can do it. If you need to make repairs, you can do it. You can rebuild it if you need to, and you can modify it to suit your needs. If you buy somebody else's stuff, you got this big thick umbilical cord between you and them. And personally, I consider that unhealthy as much as it is a waste of money. So there it is once again from the pragmatic Luther, Kevin Ledoux at Ledoux Guitars. Remember, the largest manufacturer of guitars in the entire town of Triangle, New York. Thanks for watching. Hope you liked the video, and I hope you'll subscribe to my channel. Have fun building guitars.